Of course, money flows to me. Of course, I am supported financially in ways I can see, in ways I can't. Of course, I always have more than enough. Of course, my work is valuable. Of course, I am compensated well for my energy, ideas, and presence. Of course, income expands as I expand. Of course, I attract aligned opportunities. Of course, my business grows in ways that feel natural and sustainable. Of course, wealth builds around me. Of course, I am open to receiving from expected and unexpected places. Of course, financial overflow feels safe for me. Of course, I am becoming wealthier every year. Of course, I manage money with clarity and confidence. Of course, abundance feels normal in my life now. Of course, I live comfortably. Of course, I invest in myself with ease. Of course, money supports my freedom, peace, and expansion. Of course, I believe in myself. Of course, I trust the person I'm becoming. Of course, I stand firmly in who I am. Of course, I am worthy without needing to prove it. Of course, I respect my energy, my time, and my standards. Of course, I take up space naturally. Of course, my presence is felt before I even speak. Of course, I belong in rooms I walk into. Of course, I choose myself. Of course, I honor what feels right for me. Of course, I lead my life from self-trust. Of course, I operate from self-respect and self-love. Of course, I feel grounded in my identity. Of course, I am loved deeply. Of course, I attract relationships that feel safe and reciprocal. Of course, I am surrounded by people who see and value me. Of course, I don't have to chase connections. Of course, the right people naturally stay in my life. Of course, love flows easily to me. Of course, I communicate clearly and receive understanding in return. Of course, I feel supported in my relationships. Of course, emotional safety is my normal. Of course, I am appreciated. Of course, I am chosen. Of course, I experience love that feels calm, steady, and real. Of course, my relationships evolve as I evolve. Of course, I allow closeness without losing myself. Of course, I receive the love I give. Of course, my life can change very quickly. Of course, I am available for massive expansion. Of course, I step into new timelines with ease. Of course, I release who I used to be. Of course, I align with bigger opportunities. Of course, breakthroughs happen for me. Of course, I am supported through every shift. Of course, my reality loves to upgrade. Of course, my standards will rise. Of course, my environment reflects my growth. Of course, I am ready for the life I asked for. Of course, I hold it with stability. Of course, I don't need to force anything. Of course, what's meant for me will find me. Of course, I can relax and still receive. Of course, I release timelines and pressure. Of course, I trust what's unfolding. Of course, I let things come together naturally. Of course, I allow space for things to align. Of course, I feel safe letting go. Of course, I am supported even in the unknown. Of course, life is working behind the scenes for me. Of course, I can breathe, I can soften, I can live fully while everything aligns. Of course, what's mine doesn't pass me. Of course, I receive at the right time. Of course, I am already on the right path.